The boardroom on the 14th floor of Caldwell and Morris Financial smelled of mahogany polish and the kind of silence that arrives just before something permanent. 11 faces sat around a table built for power, and Natalie Harrington stood at its head, thinner than she had been 6 months ago, but carrying herself with the precision of a woman who had calculated every variable in the room before anyone else had finished their coffee. Her blazer was black, her posture absolute, and her voice carried without effort across the long stretch of polished wood. Before we vote on the restructuring proposal, I need the board to review an internal report that was never meant to reach this table. The door opened. Marcus Cole walked in carrying a file box, 4 hard drives stacked on top, and 73 notarized affidavits bound in 3 separate folders. He was not wearing the navy suit of a senior analyst. He was not carrying the Meridian portfolio. He set the box down at the center of the table with the measured calm of a man who had rehearsed nothing because the truth does not require rehearsal. Derek Whitfield stood so fast his chair struck the credenza behind him. "This is a board-level session, Natalie. An analyst has no standing here." Natalie did not look at Derek. She looked at the 11 faces who controlled the future of the company her father had built. From a single rented office on 5th Avenue South 31 years ago. He is not presenting as an analyst. He is presenting as legal counsel, and he is my husband. The room did not gasp. It calcified. Every breath in that space turned to glass. And in the silence, Marcus Cole opened the first folder with hands that did not tremble, because the man standing in that boardroom had already survived every version of fear that mattered. But 7 months earlier, Marcus Cole was none of those things. 7 months earlier, he was a 38-year-old black man sitting in the parking garage beneath Charlotte Avenue at 6:47 on a Wednesday morning in March, staring at a wedding ring resting in the cup holder of a 12-year-old Honda Civic. Sarah had been gone 4 years. Lung cancer, diagnosed in January, buried by April. A timeline so compressed it felt less like a disease and more like a robbery committed in broad daylight. He had not removed the ring for 1,519 days, through every morning of solo parenthood, through every evening of teaching himself to cook meals Sarah used to make from memory, through every parent-teacher conference where the empty chair beside him announced her absence louder than any words. He removed it last night because his daughter asked him to. Maya was 7, gap-toothed, ferociously curious, and building a solar system model out of painted styrofoam balls for her 2nd grade science fair at the public school on Hillsborough Pike. She had looked up from Saturn's rings with acrylic paint on her fingers and asked the question with the plain surgical honesty only children possess. "Daddy, why do you still wear the ring if Mommy isn't coming back?" He had no answer that a 7-year-old would accept, and no answer that a 38-year-old could survive hearing himself say aloud. So he slid it off at 2 in the morning while Maya slept, and he placed it in the cup holder because the glove box felt too much like burial and his pocket felt too much like pretending. $847 in his checking account. Rent was $1,100, due in 9 days. The apartment on Belmont Boulevard smelled of fresh paint because the landlord had covered water damage rather than fixing it, and the whole space carried the feeling of a waiting room where the appointment would never be called. He had his books, his work laptop, a television he kept muted because the sound of other people's living rooms made the silence in his own feel architectural. Every morning, he woke at 5:30, sliced an apple into star shapes because Sarah had started that tradition when Maya was 2, Packed a lunchbox with a note inside because a child who had lost her mother deserved to open something that felt like being remembered, and drove his daughter to school before driving himself to the 14th floor. The 14th floor was the only place left that made sense. He walked past Natalie Harrington's office at 7:12. She was already there. She was always already there. 4 years, and he had never once arrived before her, as though punctuality for Natalie was not a habit, but a condition of existence, something coded into the architecture of who she was. She managed $420 million in client portfolios without raising her voice. She commanded rooms full of men twice her age with nothing more than competence so total it functioned as gravity. In 4 years, she had never crossed a single professional boundary, never asked a personal question, never permitted the distance between employer and employee to bend even slightly under the weight of familiarity. She looked up as he passed. Her eyes dropped to his left hand, to the bare ring finger, and something behind her expression shifted for exactly the time it takes a vault door to recognize an incorrect code before resetting to locked. 1.5 seconds. Long enough for Marcus to notice, short enough for her to pretend it had not happened. She called him in, closed the door, did not mention the Hrick's report open on her screen. Instead, she looked at his hand, and her voice carried the particular gentleness of a woman who understood loss not as a concept, but as a permanent resident. "I see you took off your ring." "Marcus." He did not answer. "I'm not asking why. I just want you to know I noticed." Then she pushed a 2-inch file across the desk. The Meridian account. The most complex portfolio in the building. A web of 14 institutional clients across 3 time zones with compliance requirements that had defeated 2 senior analysts before him. Her eyes were steady, almost clinical, but beneath the steadiness lived something he would only recognize months later as the first act of a woman who had already decided to trust him with far more than numbers. You think better when you're challenged. Don't waste the capacity. He worked until 9 that night. The apartment was dark when he returned, Maya asleep in her bed with the styrofoam Jupiter still drying on the kitchen table. The silence met him at the door the way it always did. But for the first time in 4 years, it did not feel like the silence was winning. 2 weeks later, Derek Whitfield taught Marcus what the 14th floor really was. The client presentation had gone flawlessly. Marcus had delivered the Meridian analysis with a precision that left the room nodding, every projection supported, every risk quantified to the 3rd decimal. The clients were reaching for their pens when Derek walked in, all 6'2" of silver-templed authority, and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder with the casual weight of a man who had never once questioned his right to touch. "Excellent work, Marcus. You see, everyone, we invest heavily in our diversity hiring initiatives. This young man is living proof that the program works." The room froze in the particular way rooms freeze when something ugly has been said in a pleasant voice. 6 clients, 2 junior analysts, and Jenna Park, Natalie's assistant, standing at the doorway with her tablet pressed against her chest. Marcus felt the hand on his shoulder the way a person feels a stain spreading across white fabric, something visible to everyone and impossible to undo. He did not raise his voice. He did not step away. His spine remained exactly where it was, because 4 years of single parenthood on $800 and a broken lease, and a daughter who needed to believe the world had a structure that made sense, had taught him that dignity is not performed. It is maintained. But I was hired because I scored in the top 2% nationally on the CFA examination, Mr. Whitfield. Not because of any program. Derek's smile did not waver. Of course, of course. Just saying we're proud. Jenna's eyes found Marcus across the room. What he saw there was not surprise. It was recognition, the look of someone who had watched this scene play out before in different rooms with different names and had been waiting for someone to finally hold still long enough to see the pattern. The pattern revealed itself over 3 weeks with the quiet inevitability of water damage spreading beneath fresh paint. Marcus was omitted from 2 strategy meetings without explanation. His emails received responses after an average of 47 hours. His colleagues at the same level averaged 6. His promotion request from 2 years prior, the one Natalie had approved and forwarded, had been flagged as deferred indefinitely by operations with no documentation, no review, no name attached to the decision except the absence of a name, which in institutional architecture is its own kind of signature. Jenna met him at a coffee shop on 12th Avenue South after hours. She placed a napkin on the table with a name written in blue ink. Rosa Okafor. Rosa lived in an apartment on Dickerson Pike with steel-reinforced file cabinets that took up half her living room. She opened the door, looked at Marcus, and asked a question that carried the weight of 3 years of isolation. How many are you? How many what? Black employees at Caldwell and Morris who figured out something was wrong. She opened the cabinet. 73 complaints filed over 6 years. Every race, in every floor, every department, all closed by human resources within 72 hours. No investigations conducted, no findings issued. 14 employees resigned. 8 were terminated within 6 months of filing, every termination coded as performance-related. Rosa herself had been fired 3 years ago when she attempted to escalate the pattern to the board. Her voice carried no bitterness, only the particular steadiness of a woman who had been disbelieved so many times she had stopped performing conviction and simply let the paper speak. I kept copies of everything, 73 files, 6 years, and Derek Whitfield signed off on every single closure. Marcus looked at the stack. His hands were not shaking from fear. They were shaking from the specific kind of anger that lives in the body of a man who has spent his entire life being measured twice and believed half. The kind of anger that does not explode because it has learned, at great personal cost, that explosion is what they expect and stillness is what they cannot prepare for. He drove home at 10:17. Maya was asleep on the couch, the television casting blue light across her face, her science project half finished on the coffee table. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who watched her on late nights, whispered from the doorway that the child had asked 3 times when her father was coming home. He carried Maya to bed. She stirred against his shoulder, her voice thick with sleep, and something else, something he had never heard in her voice before, something that sounded like the first bruise a child receives from a world she had previously trusted to be kind. Daddy? A boy at school said I can't play with them because I'm different. Marcus stood beside his daughter's bed in the dark. He stood there for a long time. 73 files in a cabinet on Dickerson Pike. A 7-year-old girl learning for the first time that the world sorts people into categories she never asked to be placed in. A man named Derek Whitfield who had turned an entire company into a machine for making that sorting invisible. Marcus Cole had seen the files. He had heard his daughter's voice break on a word she should not have had to learn for years. He knew who Derek Whitfield was and what the 14th floor had been hiding beneath its polished floors and quarterly reports. But what Marcus did not know, what he could not have known, standing in that dark bedroom with his daughter's breathing settling into the rhythm of trust that only a child can offer a parent who has not yet failed her, was that Natalie Harrington, the woman who had handed him the hardest file in the building, the woman who had never missed a single day of work in 4 years, would not come to the office tomorrow morning. And the reason for her absence would change everything he thought he understood about the 14th floor, about Natalie, and about the specific kind of courage it takes to whisper 3 words to someone when you have spent your entire life making certain no one ever got close enough to hear you say them. Natalie's desk sat empty at 7:12 the next morning. Out by 7:45, the entire 14th floor had registered the absence the way a building registers a missing support beam, not through any single visible crack, but through a subtle redistribution of weight that made everything feel slightly less certain. Jenna sat at the assistant station with her hands folded and her eyes carrying the particular unease of someone who knows more than she is permitted to share. In 4 years, Natalie Harrington had not missed a single morning, not during the ice storm that paralyzed Nashville for 3 days in February, not during the week bronchitis stole her voice so completely she conducted an entire client call through written notes slid across her desk to Jenna, who read them aloud with the cadence of a woman translating scripture. She returned the following day, blazer pressed, the posture immaculate, every surface of her restored to factory settings. But Marcus had spent 4 years studying numbers for the gaps between what was reported and what was true, and the gap in Natalie was visible to anyone trained to look. She rose from her chair with a 2-second delay that had not existed before. She paused mid-sentence in a corridor conversation and pressed her fingertips to the wall as though confirming the building was still solid. In the elevator one afternoon, when the doors closed and she believed herself alone, she shut her eyes and laid her left palm flat against the steel panel and breathed with the deliberate rhythm of someone reminding their lungs that breathing was not optional, that the body does not get to stop simply because the mind has received information it cannot metabolize. Marcus watched. He said nothing. Some observations are worth more when held than when spoken. 3 weeks later, at 9:17 on a Wednesday evening, she walked into his office carrying 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him and crossed into territory that had no line item on any quarterly report. "My mother died alone, Marcus." The keys beneath his fingers went silent. She had people around her, technically. Nurses, a neighbor who checked in Tuesdays. But she died alone in the way that actually matters, without someone who chose her specifically, without someone who was there because they had decided to be, and not because a schedule or an obligation or a sense of civic decency had placed them in the room. She looked at her coffee the way a person looks at something they are holding only because their hands need occupation. "Honor, I have been thinking about that a great deal lately." She left at 9:34. Her heels faded down the corridor in precise intervals, each step metered like a metronome counting down toward something she had not yet named. Marcus sat in that office for a long time afterward, watching the Nashville skyline through glass that separated the 14th floor from a city that moved and breathed and continued without any awareness that inside this building, a woman who controlled $420 million had just admitted that the thing she could not control was the empty chair beside her own life. Thursday morning, she told him about the cancer. She stood at her office window with her back to him. Watching Nashville move 14 stories below the way a person watches a city they are no longer certain they will grow old in. Morning light caught the edges of her profile, and she looked both commanding and fragile in the same frame. The way a cathedral looks minutes before an earthquake, still beautiful, still upright, but suddenly and terribly aware of the fault line beneath. Breast cancer, early stage, diagnosed in January. She had handled it the way she handled foreign exchange fluctuations and hostile acquisition attempts, alone, methodically, with a treatment calendar blocked in color-coded intervals and a spreadsheet tracking her white blood cell counts beside her client performance metrics. She had taken a taxi to her first 3 infusions because independence was not a preference for Natalie Harrington, but a structural element, a load-bearing wall she had built her entire identity around. But the 4th infusion had left her unable to stand without assistance for 11 minutes in a clinic hallway, and her oncologist had advised against traveling alone going forward. She had reviewed her mental list of every person she knew, every colleague, every client contact, every woman she had shared a conference stage with, every man who had offered a business card with intentions she had cataloged and filed under polite disinterest. The list was long. The number of people on it she felt she could call was 0. I am telling you because I trust your discretion, not to make this your responsibility. Marcus looked at her. I know this woman who had built 14 floors from a single rented room, who had noticed his bare finger on the worst morning of his year and responded not with pity, but with the heaviest file in the building, who ran markets and managed futures and had never once in 4 years asked another human being for anything she could not invoice. I'll drive you. Thursday. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the weight a word carries when a person who has never asked for help is deciding whether to accept it. Yes, she whispered finally, and the word cost her something she would never quantify. He drove her every Thursday for 5 weeks, 4 hours each session in a waiting room chair that seemed engineered to discourage lingering, reading financial reports he had already memorized while somewhere down a corridor, the most formidable woman he had ever known sat with chemicals entering her bloodstream and refused to let anyone see the war her body was waging against itself. He drove her home each afternoon through Nashville traffic that moved with the indifferent rhythm of a city, unaware that the woman in his passenger seat had spent the morning fighting something invisible with nothing but discipline and the quiet animal stubbornness of a body that had been ordered not to quit. Meanwhile, Derek Whitfield smelled weakness the way certain animals detect a frequency change in the air before a storm. He made 3 phone calls on 3 consecutive evenings to 3 board members whose loyalty he had cultivated over a decade of golf invitations and quarterly dinners at the Capitol Grill. His pitch was surgical, calibrated to sound like concern while functioning as a coup. Natalie's health was compromised. The company needed stable leadership. Her father, God rest him, had trusted Derek to protect the institution, not to watch it diminish under the stewardship of someone whose body was currently betraying her at a cellular level. He never used the word cancer. He used the phrase leadership continuity 7 times in 3 calls, because Derek Whitfield understood that in corporate architecture, the right euphemism is more lethal than any direct accusation. He drafted a formal proposal for emergency restructuring. Well, the vote was scheduled for Monday, 3 weeks out. Enough time for Natalie's next infusion to leave her depleted. Enough time for the board to mistake exhaustion for incompetence. Enough time for the man who had buried 73 complaints to bury one more thing. Marcus did not know about the phone calls. But he knew about the 73 files, and they had taken up residence in a part of his mind that would not allow sleep to function properly. By day, he managed the Meridian portfolio and drove Natalie to treatment. By night, after Maya's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of a child who still trusted morning to arrive safely, he sat at the kitchen table with Rosa's documents spread across the surface like evidence of a disease that had been misdiagnosed as health for 6 years. And the investigation compressed 3 weeks into a discipline that felt almost mechanical. He contacted 14 former employees who had been terminated within 6 months of filing complaints. 9 agreed to provide notarized statements. He built a statistical model comparing performance ratings by race across every department and every year of Derek's tenure. The results were not ambiguous. Black employees received ratings 31% lower than white employees at the same level, despite generating 12% higher client revenue. The gap was not organic. It was engineered, a system calibrated to produce a predetermined outcome and disguised as meritocracy. Rosa provided the keystone, an internal email chain from 2019 sent from Derek's personal company account to the head of human resources, 4 sentences that read like a manual for institutional erasure. Close this file. Diversity numbers are within federal thresholds. Do not create documentation. If pressed, cite performance metrics and move on. Marcus read the email 3 times. Each reading made the words smaller and the system they protected larger. A machine so elegant in its cruelty that it could destroy a career while generating a compliance report that said everything was fine. He dug further. Derek's previous employer in Memphis, a mid-size investment firm where he had served as chief operating officer for 11 years. 28 complaints of racial discrimination during his tenure, all closed without investigation. Same language in the closure memos, same statistical patterns, same silence. 73 in Nashville plus 28 in Memphis. 101 lives compressed into filing cabinets across 2 cities in 17 years, overseen by a single man who had learned that the most effective form of discrimination is the kind that leaves no fingerprints and generates excellent quarterly numbers. Rosa looked at Marcus across her kitchen table on Dickerson Pike. The files spread between them like the wreckage of something that had been sinking for years, while the surface remained perfectly still. You read federal statute like it's a quarterly report. I graduated from Fisk University School of Law, class of 2018, top 5%. Sarah was diagnosed 4 months before I sat for the bar. I needed income that could start immediately, so I took the analyst position and the degree went into a drawer. He paused. It stayed in the drawer for 6 years because I told myself the timing was wrong. I think the timing was always right. I just wasn't ready to use it for what it was meant for. On the 5th Thursday, Marcus pulled into Natalie's driveway in Green Hills, and the engine ticked into silence, and the neighborhood held still in the particular way that expensive streets hold still at dusk. Every sound carrying further than it should. Every silence meaning more than it would in a louder place. Natalie did not open her door. She sat looking at her hands the way a woman looks at instruments she is no longer sure she knows how to play. Be my husband. The words arrived so quietly they could have been mistaken for the evening air shifting through a cracked window. Not romantically, she continued, speaking to her own hands. Not that way. I mean someone who shows up on purpose. Someone who chooses to be present because they decided to, not because a payroll system or a professional obligation or a medical emergency forced proximity. She had a company. She had a strategy for everything that could be modeled and forecasted and optimized. She had 7 employees whose future she managed with more care than she had ever applied to the question of who would sit beside her when the scan results came back, and the doctor paused 1 second too long before speaking. What she did not have, what 5 Thursdays had illuminated with a clarity that shook something loose in the foundation of who she believed herself to be, was the thing Marcus had given her without contract or condition or expectation of return. Marcus did not answer. He walked her to her door and drove home through Nashville in a silence that bore no resemblance to the silence he had been living inside for 4 years. That old silence was absence. This one had weight and direction. It was asking him something, and waiting with the patience of a question that already knew its answer. That night, Maya slept, and Marcus stood at the kitchen window looking at a city full of lights belonging to people whose lives he would never know. And he thought about the 73 files, and the woman who had whispered 3 words from the passenger seat, and the daughter who had asked why the world sorted her into a category she had never chosen. And he understood with a clarity that felt less like revelation and more like arrival, that all of it, every thread, every silence, every bare finger and every buried complaint was converging toward a single room on a single morning that had not yet come. He called Natalie at 6 the next morning. "When you said you didn't mean it romantically, did you mean that completely? Or were you protecting yourself from the answer?" A long pause. The kind of pause that holds 2 truths at once and is deciding which one to release. "Both. Possibly. I need to see you. Not about that, though also about that. About Derek Whitfield. About 73 files. About the company your father built." A longer pause. Then, with the voice of a woman who had spent 41 years building walls and had just heard someone knock from the inside, "Come to my house. Bring everything you have." Sunday morning in Green Hills. 73 files spread across Natalie's kitchen table. Green tea cooling beside the documents because she drank it out of habit inherited from her mother. A ritual maintained not for taste, but for the particular comfort of repeating a gesture made by someone who is no longer alive to make it. Light came through the windows in a way that slowed everything down, that made the paper feel heavier and the numbers feel more human. My father trusted Derek. I inherited that trust without auditing it. Her voice was even, but her hands trembled against the pages. He used what my father built to dismantle 101 lives over 17 years, and I never looked because I believed the structure was sound. Marcus watched her read. He watched a woman who managed millions process the specific kind of bankruptcy that no balance sheet can capture. It's the moral deficit that accumulates when an institution confuses silence with stability. You could lose Derek and lose the board with him. He has votes. Or I lose the company and keep what the company was supposed to stand for. She set down the last file. My father did not build 14 floors to hide 73 names. They built the case together over the following week. Marcus contacted Linda Tran at Bass, Berry & Sims, a civil rights attorney whose reputation in Nashville was built on the specific combination of surgical preparation and absolute refusal to bluff. Linda reviewed the files in 48 hours and confirmed they met the threshold for a Department of Justice referral under 42 U.S.C. Section 1981 and Section 1983. The referral was filed Thursday afternoon with Natalie's written authorization as CEO. To Derek's counterstrike came Friday at 11 in the evening. A special performance review placed on Marcus's file, the first step in a termination sequence designed to look procedural. 3 emails sent to competing firms in Nashville suggesting Marcus had exhibited ethical violations. A blacklist constructed from implication rather than evidence. And the board meeting accelerated by 1 week, moved from Monday to the following Thursday. A timeline engineered to catch Natalie at her most depleted. Marcus read the performance review notification in the dark of his apartment. Maya's breathing rose and fell in the next room with the trust of a child who believed her father was strong enough to hold the ceiling up indefinitely. $847. A termination would mean the apartment gone in 6 weeks, or in the school district change, the science fair project abandoned on a kitchen table in a home they no longer lived in. Rosa called at 11:47. She had one more document, a 2019 internal memo in which Derek instructed HR to revise performance evaluation criteria mid-cycle, applied exclusively to employees hired through diversity recruitment channels, not bias, policy, written, signed, and filed in a system Rosa had copied before they changed her access credentials. Tuesday morning, Natalie postponed the board meeting by 1 additional week, citing a procedural requirement for 48-hour document review before any restructuring vote. The delay was legitimate. The purpose was strategic. 7 days. Marcus put Maya to bed the night before the meeting. She looked up at him from her pillow. Saturn and Jupiter still watching from the bookshelf where the science project had been retired to honorary permanence. "Where are you going tomorrow, Daddy?" "To do something right, baby girl." "Like a superhero?" He smiled, and the smile reached places that had been closed for longer than he could calculate. "No, like your father." That same evening, Natalie sat alone in the Vanderbilt Medical Center parking lot at 6:14 with her oncologist's voice still echoing in her skull. The word he had used was encouraging, delivered with the kind of clinical certainty that leaves no room for ambiguity. Her cancer was responding. The margins were clear. The prognosis had shifted from cautious to genuinely hopeful. She sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's car because he had driven her to this appointment the way he had driven her to every appointment, with the quiet reliability of a man who understood that showing up repeatedly is the only language that cannot be misquoted. She pressed her fingers to her eyes. Her shoulders shook. She made no sound whatsoever. 45 seconds of a woman who had held everything together for 41 years, allowing the seams to open in the only space she had ever trusted enough to fall apart in. Marcus stood beside the car without speaking, without reaching for her, without attempting to repair what was not broken. Because some moments are not wounds. They are releases. And the only thing they require is a witness who understands the difference. She straightened her blazer, took one breath, then another, looked at him with eyes that were red and clear, and entirely, irreversibly finished pretending. "Don't mention this at the office." Obviously, and she laughed. 3 full seconds of unguarded, unperformed, ungoverned joy from a woman who had kept every real thing about herself behind glass so thick she had forgotten the glass was there. It was the most honest sound Marcus had ever heard another human being make, and it told him everything about tomorrow that the evidence files could not. Tomorrow morning, the 14th floor, 73 files, 101 lives, and a single boardroom where everything that had been buried was about to be exhumed by a man the institution had been designed to overlook, standing beside a woman the institution had been designed to outlast. The boardroom was full by 8:53. The 11 members seated, water glasses untouched, The particular tension of people who understand that the next 60 minutes will determine whether they were complicit or merely negligent. Derek Whitfield occupied the chair to the right of center with the posture of a man who had counted his votes and found the arithmetic comfortable. He had 4 confirmed allies. He needed 6. He believed the remaining 2 would follow momentum, because in 30 years of corporate maneuvering, he had learned that most people do not vote their conscience. They vote their safety. Natalie opened the session at 9 exactly. She did not reference the restructuring proposal. She did not acknowledge Derek's presence with anything more than the peripheral awareness a person gives to furniture they intend to rearrange. She informed the board that an internal compliance matter had been identified that required review before any governance changes could proceed, and that the findings would be presented by outside legal counsel retained at her authorization as chief executive. The door opened and Marcus entered carrying the evidence of 17 years arranged in the order a federal prosecutor would recognize, because Linda Tran had reviewed the sequence twice and confirmed it met evidentiary standards for DOJ referral. He set the materials at the center of the table and opened the first folder without preamble, because the truth, when it has waited 6 years to be spoken, does not require an introduction. Derek's objection came before the first page was turned. Natalie, this is a governance meeting. Whatever this is can be submitted through proper channels. These are the proper channels, Mr. Whitfield. You closed every other one. Marcus began with the numbers because numbers do not need credibility. They carry their own. 73 formal complaints filed by employees across every department over 6 consecutive years. Each complaint logged into the Human Resources Management System. Each complaint closed within 72 hours. 0 investigations initiated. 0 findings issued. The closure rate for discrimination complaints at Caldwell and Morris was 100%. A statistical impossibility in any organization employing more than 40 people across racial demographics, unless the system processing complaints had been designed to produce exactly one outcome. He moved to the second layer. The 14 employees resigned within 12 months of filing. 8 were terminated within 6 months, each termination coded under performance deficiency. Each performance review revised downward in the quarter immediately following the complaint. He displayed the 2019 internal directive from Derek's account, instructing HR to modify evaluation criteria mid-cycle, applied exclusively to employees recruited through diversity channels. The language was precise enough to function as a manual and vague enough to survive a cursory legal review. The work of a man who understood that institutional racism operates most efficiently when it looks like paperwork. The third layer was Memphis. 28 complaints across 11 years at Derek's previous firm. Same closure timelines. Same termination patterns. Same silence from leadership. 101 people across 2 cities and nearly 2 decades. Their careers compressed into filing cabinets, and their objections archived into systems built to make objection meaningless. Marcus paused. He looked at the 11 faces around the table, and when he spoke next, his voice carried the temperature of a man who has learned that the most dangerous thing in a room full of powerful people is not anger, but precision. Among the 73 employees affected in Nashville, there were 4 single mothers who lost their primary income, 2 military veterans who were blacklisted from the industry within a year of termination, and a man named Robert Okafor, husband of Rosa Okafor, your former head of human resources, who suffered a fatal cardiac event 8 months after his wife was fired for attempting to bring these files to the board. He died under financial stress that your system created and your silence sustained. Marcus closed the folder. 101 lives are not a diversity statistic. They are a federal matter. The room held the kind of silence that does not fade. It accumulates. A board member at the far end of the table, a woman who had served for 9 years without ever raising a procedural objection, leaned forward. Mr. Cole, you are listed as a senior financial analyst. On what authority are you presenting legal findings to this board? Natalie answered without looking away from the documents. Marcus Cole holds a Juris Doctor from Fisk University, class of 2018, top 5%. He did not practice because his wife was dying and his daughter needed a father with a paycheck, not a career plan. He has been employed on this floor for 4 years, during which time he was denied promotion twice through the same system he has just described to you. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the particular weight of a woman who had spent 41 years choosing her words with the care of a surgeon and had decided that this sentence was worth every risk attached to it. He is also my husband, and the referral to the Department of Justice was filed 48 hours ago with my written authorization, because the company my father built does not get to survive by burying the people it was supposed to serve. Derek's chair scraped the floor. He looked around the table for the 4 votes he had secured over dinners and golf rounds and carefully worded appeals to self-preservation. 2 of them met his eyes. 2 did not. The arithmetic that had seemed so comfortable at 8:53 had become something else entirely by 9:27. The vote was 9-2. Derek Whitfield was removed as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. His access credentials were revoked before he reached the elevator. His files were sealed pending federal review. He walked out of the building on Charlotte Avenue, carrying nothing except the particular expression of a man who had mistaken silence for loyalty and discovered too late that the two are not the same thing. Within 48 hours, the Nashville Press carried the story. 3 firms across Tennessee initiated internal audits after former employees came forward citing the Caldwell and Morris disclosures as precedent. The Department of Justice opened a formal investigation spanning both Nashville and Memphis operations, covering 17 years of documented suppression. A restitution fund of $4.7 million was established for affected employees and their families, funded by corporate reserves that Natalie authorized without board debate because she understood that some debts do not require a vote to be acknowledged as real. Rosa Okafor returned to the 14th floor as the new Director of Human Resources. She stood in the doorway of the office she had been escorted out of 3 years earlier and looked at the desk where her files had been deleted and her access revoked and her professional reputation reduced to a termination code in a system designed to make people like her disappear. Marcus found her there on her first morning, standing motionless with her hand resting on the door frame. 3 years I kept those files in a cabinet on Dickerson Pike. I did not know if anyone would ever come for them. Marcus stood beside her in the hallway where 4 years of his own silence had lived. I didn't come because I was brave. I came because my daughter asked me why the world treats her differently, and I did not have an answer that let me stay quiet. They married the following spring at a vineyard outside Franklin, Tennessee. But the ceremony was small. Late afternoon light poured gold across the rows of vines and the white chairs and the faces of people who had earned the right to witness something that had been built not from romance, but from the specific gravity of 2 people who had seen each other at their most reduced and decided that what remained was enough. Jenna cried from the moment Natalie appeared at the end of the aisle to the moment the officiant said, "Amen," a duration Natalie had predicted within 15 seconds based on Jenna's documented emotional response patterns at 3 previous office events. A calculation she shared with Marcus before the ceremony with the deadpan statistical confidence of a woman who could not stop being who she was, even on the day she was becoming someone new. Maya served as flower girl. She was 8.5 now, her teeth grown in straight, her confidence carrying the particular architecture of a child who has watched her father stand in front of powerful people and choose the truth over safety. Before the ceremony, she tugged Marcus's sleeve and looked up at him with eyes that contained both Sarah's warmth and something entirely her own. "Daddy, Ethan from school asked what you do. I told him you protect people who get treated unfairly, and that you love someone very smart." Marcus knelt. The vineyard light caught Maya's face, and for a moment he saw every morning of sliced apple stars and packed lunches and whispered bedtime answers to questions no 7-year-old should have to ask. And he understood that the architecture of fatherhood is not built in the large moments, but in the accumulation of small ones that a child carries forward into the person they are becoming. Natalie walked toward him down the aisle, and she did not look like a chief executive or an authority or the woman whose reputation made grown men adjust their posture. She looked like someone who had carried everything alone for a very long time and had finally, deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost and the reward, decided to set some of it down. Marriage to Natalie Harrington was not simple. She scheduled important conversations on shared calendars. She reviewed quarterly projections at breakfast. She was precise and demanding and occasionally exhausting in ways that made ordinary life feel like a permanent performance review conducted by someone whose standards were both unreasonable and completely correct. But when the scan results arrived, when a difficult meeting ended, when she opened the bottom drawer of her desk on a hard afternoon and looked at her mother's photograph and needed someone to know she had survived another day without the woman who taught her to drink green tea, she called Marcus first. And that, after everything, was the whole of it. 6 months after the wedding, Maya won the Davidson County Science Fair with a project titled "When Numbers Tell Secrets: Why Some Workers Get Lower Scores." Hand-drawn bar graphs in colored pencil, 73 data points. Or a hypothesis written in the handwriting of a 9-year-old who had learned from her father that data tells the stories people try to hide. The judges asked where she got the idea. She stood in front of the display board with her hands clasped behind her back and her chin raised and the gap-toothed smile long replaced by something steadier. "My dad taught me that numbers tell the stories people try to bury. And my stepmom taught me that if you're going to present data, you'd better have your methodology right." Marcus Cole had walked onto the 14th floor 7 months before the boardroom vote with a bare ring finger and nothing in his chest that resembled a plan. The most broken version of himself had entered a building designed to overlook him. And the woman who ran that building had seen something worth trusting before he believed there was anything left to trust. She whispered 3 words that should have been impossible. He answered with 73 files that should have been buried forever. And between the whisper and the answer, between the passenger seat and the boardroom, between a 7-year-old's question and a 9-year-old's science fair, they built something that no system designed to make people disappear could touch. Not because it was louder than the institution, because it was more precise.